How can people be so wasteful? Throwing away a perfectly salvageable content idea. I don't have one of these in orange. Ugh. Don't scratch the paint. Don't scratch the paint. Trunks are really deep, but they're not very deep. Please don't leak.
Never know where you belong. Walk on! Yeah!
Homie! Homie! Mother! These things are heavy.
These Chinese electric log splitters are a fantastic tool to have around the property. These big gassers are what you want for burning through 3 cords in a Saturday, but if you just need a couple of rounds split and you lack the constitution or inclination to swing a maul, these are the ticket. There's a million different models and they're all basically the same. There's not much to them. However, they all seem to end up in the scrap pile for one of only a few different reasons. So today, we're going to sacrifice this street urchin to the gods of curiosity and frugality, so that if yours ever breaks, maybe you can fix it for cheap, instead of putting it on the side of the road so a moderately sober engineer can make an example out of you. I'm going to go symptom by symptom with timestamps in the description and leave no component unmolested. Starting with the electrical side of things, this is the danger box. Don't be a wuss who unplugs the splitter first. This is America, land of the free and home of the what? Let's say you go to push the big power button and she leaves you cold and wanting. Dead. First and most obvious thing to do, if it's got one of these breakers, check said breaker. You can also ohm it out if you're not sure. Next, we're going to check that switch. These things are exposed to the elements, wood shavings, careless operators, big logs. It's tough life for a switch. To test it, remove it by unscrewing the bezel nut. These switches break both the hot line and the neutral line, so get out your meter and check for some continuity. This one measures fine, but if yours doesn't, I would just recommend bypassing it properly and go to Harbor Freight and buy one of these foot switches instead. Use that to control the motor. It's easier anyway. The first and most obvious cause for this particular malady is an ID10T error. These draw a ton of current, and not all extension cords are created equal. Your 50-foot 14-gauge cord ain't gonna cut it with one of these. Voltage drops over distance, and if you need a long cord, get at least a 10-gauge. Assuming you're not an ID10T, here's another common cause for the buzzing. I accidentally left this one outside in the elements for a few years. So here's a real-world example. The first thing you can do is shove something long and hard in there and see if the motor spins freely. If not, the housing, bearings, or fan blades could be damaged, stalling out the rotor. So check for that. If it does spin freely, which we're going to pretend this does for the purpose of this video, and it still won't start and buzzes all the time, you're almost definitely going to need a new capacitor. In addition to being fun 22 plinking targets, these guys are critical for high-torque single-phase AC motors like this. They store and release phase-shifted current to the start winding in the motor, giving it an extra boost. When these fail, the motor can struggle to start. The right way to test these is with a capacitance meter, but you can ballpark it with a regular voltmeter. Not to be a hipster, but analog is better for this, even more so if it's communist. Capitalist digital meters will work, though. Before you do anything, my lawyer would like me to remind you to short the terminals together against something metal and not connected to you to make sure the capacitor is empty. Set the meter to ohms and ohm out the capacitor. A good capacitor should start out as a short and slowly approach open as it charges off your meter. Analog meters are better for showing relative change. That needle should jump to a short and then slowly fall back to open. If it doesn't, it's dead. If it does, that doesn't necessarily mean the capacitor is in spec, it just means it's capacitizing, so beware of false negatives. Hopefully this is your problem, because everybody loves low-hanging fruit. A new capacitor is cheap. Much cheaper than a capacitance meter, so if you're still in doubt, just buy one. Make sure the capacitance is the same, and the voltage is equal or greater. Other than that, they're basically universal. I'm gonna go put this crusty old girl back outside. Maybe I'll try to replace the motor or take it apart and see if I can free it up. But honestly, this looks like it could use a predator swap. The off-grid portability of my big tow-behind gas splitter with the fit-in-my-trunk ability of a small electric splitter. Let me know if that's a project you'd be interested in watching me fumble. Hey Siri, turn the workshop lights back on.
Okay, which room? Basement, dining room?
The workshop! This spicy puppy is rated for 15.0 amps, and if you've got it running on a 15 amp breaker that happens to be any older than Cooper DeJean, I would not hesitate to blame the breaker itself, especially if it's one of those satanic arc fault devices, so try another outlet on a different breaker before proceeding. These particular motors will have two windings, a main winding and the start winding we mentioned earlier. You can see two pairs of wires going into the motor, two going from the power switch to the run winding and two coming from the capacitor going to the start winding. Let's ohm them out and make sure they're not shorted, open, or shorted to ground. Every motor is slightly different, but in my experience, the run windings should fall between half an ohm and an ohm. Also make sure neither leg has any continuity to ground. The start winding should have a slightly higher resistance, somewhere between 1 and 3 ohms. Again, make sure nothing is shorted to ground. There are a few other possible explanations for a popping breaker, and to my squealing delight, the best way to demonstrate it is to take this apart and see what's inside. Feed the wires through. Sneaky ground wire. Oh, Jesus.
I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. Sleeps all night and I work all day. He's a lumberjack and he's okay. He sleeps all night and he works all day. I put on women's clothing and hang around in bars. I cut down trees, I wear high heels, suspenders and a bra. I wish I'd been a girlie, just like my dear papa.
Why won't you budge? Ah, whoops. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on you. In the interest of getting this cap off without damaging the motor more, let's just take it out completely. This motor has a motor mounting bolt here, and we have to take these two screws out on either side holding the wheels on, plus these nuts. Looks like the previous owner had too much spinach. That valve is stuck on. Well, we know why it was on the street. We'll deal with that later. This is where the motor connects to the hydraulic pump housing. It's made of aluminum, so it's prone to warping and cracking from uneven torquing. It's also got sealing surfaces in there, so as tempting as it may be to rattle these off with your big impact, you must use hand tools for this. Be gentle. I see no conceivable way that this could fall over. Before it decides to, I'm going to go have lunch while it pisses away the fluid. It'll drain a little faster if you open that bleed valve that's on the opposite end. That's better. Don't use the drain plug for this. That would be just so unimaginative. With the motor removed, we can take a moment to nerd out on the basics of hydraulic pumps. As the electric motor turns, these gears create suction that pulls in fluid from one side, right here. It's forced out through this port under very high pressure into the inlet of the cylinder, which is currently submerged, and then into the cylinder, which forces this piston rod out like that, which pulls these rods, which pulls on the ram, brings it towards the wedge, and splits your wood. All right, Daddy's not dicking around anymore. Here's another ghost of videos past. Got it. Look at that beefy rotor. No brushes here. This is an induction motor. I'm also not seeing a centrifugal switch because this is a permanent split capacitor motor. When you pull the rotor out, keep tabs on anything that falls off the other end. This gear is clocked on with this little round key. You lose that key, you are dicked. Permanent split capacitor motors leave the capacitor in the circuit while it's running. This means they don't need a centrifugal switch to take it out of the circuit once it's up to speed. These are both permanent split capacitor motors, so there's no centrifugal switch to fail. I'm not going to tell you that all electric splitters use PSC motors, so unless yours has one, you'll want to test that. I brought up centrifugal switches and I'm going to demonstrate one, damn it. Here's a scrap vacuum pump motor. As those weights spread out, it takes pressure off that switch lever, which makes and breaks contact. So if your splitter has a centrifugal switch, make sure that mechanism is able to break contact as the motor spins up. If these checks all pass, try starting the motor with this end disconnected from any mechanical components. If it still doesn't work, you likely need a new motor. Parts for these Wen lumberjacks, as well as the Harbor Freight models, are actually orderable, believe it or not. If it runs strong, you may have a mechanical problem on the mechanical end of things. Let's dig in. There's a couple things that could be wrong with your hydraulics. There's nothing wrong with these hydraulics, so let's take this one apart for no reason. There's 4 bolts here, and remember, this is an aluminum sealing surface. Do not use power tools. Hand tools only. Find a piece of fibrous hydraulic surface protectant and break the RTV free. Don't lose these or the splitter will explode. Depending on the model, those nuts might not be nuts. They may be super long bolts. Super long, easy to thread back in bolts. On this one, they're threaded rods. How in the blazes? The other end of the ram is welded onto this bracket, which pulls on the rods connected to the ram rods. You can run these nuts down to relieve some of the tension on the monster return spring. This one has this adjustable stopper, which isn't going to allow that. The Harbor Freight ones don't have that feature. You see what I did there? The cylinder should easily, and with very minimal swearing, twist free and pull out. Uh-oh, running out of workbench here. Gotta start knocking shit over. If your cylinder is bent or kinked, it's pretty much it for the splitter. It's mechanically totaled, but you could use the cylinder as a bitchin' potato gun barrel. To break the other side free, I like to thread these nuts on to protect the threads, and then I go grab my pneumatic Clarkson. Maneuver it around the ramrod nuts and pull the piston, rod, and spring assembly safely out. Mwah. To service the piston rod or piston itself, you're going to have to compress this beefy spring. You could just take the piston here, it unscrews, unscrew it until it pops off into the other room, giving someone donkey teeth. But that doesn't solve the problem of how you can get the piston back on when you're done. If there's one thing I'm afraid of, it's compressed springs. And heights. And the open ocean. Here's my trick. Zip ties. Oodles and oodles of the finest Harbor Freight zip ties. It's helpful to have a friend to pull the zip ties tight while you compress the spring coils as much as you can with your meat sticks. Someone has a mean sense of humor, and now I don't have friends. With the spring gloriously defeated, one zip tie at a time, go ahead and safely, quote-unquote, unscrew the piston. There's one O-ring in here, and this is the piston ring. Inspect it for gouges or missing chunks. Common causes for piston ring failure are running it low on fluid, running it with that bleeder screw closed for long periods of time, and trying to crush coal into diamonds with your little Chinese splitter, you overzealous baboon. It's a cheap part, and for some models, you can just buy the piston and ring assembly and just screw it on the piston rod and be done with it. If not, you're kind of f***ed. You can take the piston to your local hydraulics supplier and hope they don't laugh you out of there. If you have a 3D printer, I've seen it done, cut the old ring out and print a new one. But at that point, you really are getting obstinate about refusing to just buy a new splitter or use a maul. These little powerhouses easily generate enough force to bend the piston rod. Well, maybe not easily, but that 30-inch oak round ain't gonna split itself, and real men don't know where red lines are until we cross them. check the piston rod with a straight edge and make sure it's straight and intact. If not, then honestly, I don't have any tips for you. Either you have the skills and equipment to re-weld your frame or hydraulically press this rod straight, in which case you probably don't need this stupid video. Or you don't have that stuff and buying a whole new splitter on sale might actually be prudent. If the splitter runs sluggish or stops halfway, but everything is straight and that piston ring is intact, then you should check something that I arguably should have started this video with. Check your fluid. They all have dipsticks on the side. Here's the one on the Lumberjack, and here's the one on the Harbor Freight. These only work because hydraulic fluid doesn't compress. If your fluid level is low, these pump gears will be sucking in air, which is famously compressible. Will the hydraulic ram still move in this scenario? Probably, but it ain't gonna have no balls. Now, this is a sealed system, so your fluid should never be low. When it comes to Chinese hydraulics, if there ain't no oil under them, there ain't no oil in them. If you're a lazy hack who prefers to band-aid things instead of fix them properly, you can just keep topping it off. I prefer automatic transmission fluid. It's basically hydraulic fluid, but it's got detergents, and it's blood red, so when it blows a seal and sprays all over your face, it'll scare the shit out of your wife, which is always a gas. There's lots of seals and O-rings in these, and depending on which side of the hydraulic circuit they're on, they could simply leak, causing the splitter to run weak, or they could completely blow out and neuter the machine entirely. Harbor Freight's O-ring set is your friend here. Don't stress about choosing between metric and standard. Here's a secret. It's the same damn set, just with a different colored box. You also want to make sure you clean out these grooves of old material and put a fresh coating of RTV in there when you reassemble it. My Uncle Bill called this the Puerto Rican spring compressor. And if you find that offensive, you can yell at him, not me. But he won't hear you. Spent a long time working in industrial environments without ear protection, so he's basically deaf. He's also dead. You may need to defeat that return spring to get these nuts started. My advice? A wedge of some kind. Just hammer it down here. Which will move the piston rod that way, compressing the spring just enough to get your nuts on. We are, a half hour into this thing, and finally getting to the actual fault with this particular machine. This spring-loaded piston valve is what the control lever actuates to send high-pressure fluid into the cylinder, which moves the ram. It's stuck in, so I'm going to pop the C-clip off, promptly lose it, and then tap the valve out. Other side's a 21 mil. Usually when these get stuck, it's because of damaged O-rings, dirt in your hole, or the valve has a slight bend. The outer part of the valve taps out too. Everything looks clean, but if we slip it back in, God damn it. I'm going to do the right thing and not replace any of those chewed up O-rings. If I can get the splitter back together in one piece, maybe I'll consider it later. See that wobble? Ask me how that happens. I have no clue how that happens, but it ain't good. These are replaceable, but again, it depends on the model if you can actually source the parts. I'm going to try straightening it with a deep socket and extension on account of I can't make it worse. A little dip into some clean-ish hydraulic fluid to lube the O-rings. Oh, fuck yeah. Pop the return spring and C-clip that you probably lost back on. When the RTV cures, go ahead, open that bleed valve, and fill it with fluid. You're probably going to have to run the ram back and forth a couple times, refilling in between to fully bleed the system. And now you're ready to get back to splitting up some fuel for the fire that keeps your house warm. Nothing better than that. I want to see the CRT explode. Gotta be honest with you, I still think I prefer them all. Thanks for watching.